As children, most of us heard or read the story of Jonah. Perhaps we learned it in Sunday school or watching that wonderful VeggieTales production with those goofy pirates. As children, Jonah was a fascinating story that most of us accepted at face value. Depending on your congregation, you may not have delved into the technical details. Once we've grown up, the devil is in the details. Most adult Christians and Jews accept one of three viewpoints regarding Jonah. 1. Jonah lived for 3 days praying in the belly of a fish. 2. Jonah lived for 3 days praying in the belly of a well. 3. The story of Jonah is a parable or a myth. Those that adopt the first viewpoint reference the Hebrew word dag, used in Jonah 1:17. This is Strong reference H1709. This is the Hebrew word for fish. Those who adopt the second view point out that the term fish is generic in the Bible, and it doesn't separate fish from mammals regarding whales. They point to Job 7:12, which has been translated in English as whale, but is actually derived from the Hebrew tanniyn, that's Strong's H8577, which is a sea monster, dragon, or serpent. They say that the whale's enormous size was required to accommodate Jonah. The folks who adopt the fish view argue that it was likely a grouper, which is only limited in size by its environment, and the Goliath grouper swallows food whole without chewing. Those that adhere to explanation number 3 say that it doesn't matter anyway, since either situation is physically impossible and no one could survive in the belly of a fish or a whale, assuming they somehow made it to the belly before expiring. Once there, where did Jonah get fresh water for the 3 days and nights? What about oxygen? Did he carry a scuba tank with a 3-day supply of air? Wait a minute. Are you trying to apply logic to the Bible? This isn't allowed, right? Those that stick to explanations 1 or 2 point out that God can do anything. I concur with this last point of those holding explanations 1 and 2. Yes, God can do anything. But did he? The problem is, none of these viewpoints really jive with what the Bible actually says. God did something all right, and what actually happened is more amazing than we have been taught and makes Jonah more important than previously perceived. Let's scroll back to Jonah 1 and review what actually happened. In the first 2 verses, we're told Jonah was told by God to go to Nineveh. After this, a lot happens in verse 3, where Jonah went to Joppa and chartered a ship going to Tarshish. To fully understand this, we have to establish where Jonah started and where he went versus what he was commanded. We are told that Jonah is the son of Amittai, which really tells us very little, as his name has been lost to history. We can assume Amittai was an important man at the time to be mentioned in this manner. We can assume he was wealthy, if not powerful. Jonah had a silver spoon in his mouth. He had the means to travel. 2 Kings 14:25 tells us he was from Gath-Hepher and confirms Amittai as his father. So there is no doubt we're talking about the same Jonah. It also puts Jonah's mission squarely in the time of King Jeroboam II, who reigned in the range of 793 to 746 BC. His reign was 41 years long, according to 2 Kings 14:23. This gives us our time frame and shows that Jonah's later actions did actually have an impact on the kingdom. It establishes Jonah as a very real figure in the Bible. Please note that this map is not to scale. Nineveh was the capital of Assyria. It was located roughly 500 miles northeast of Gath-Hepher. It is safe to assume that Jonah started in Gath-Hepher, his hometown, or nearby, since Jonah 1:3 tells us he went down to Joppa, which is the most convenient port, located roughly 60 miles southwest from Gath-Hepher. From here, he planned to sail to Tarshish, which is 2,500 miles away off the coast of Spain. Jonah made very clear he wanted nothing to do with Nineveh, and he was attempting to escape the presence of God, as we are told in verse 3, and he was willing to go a long way to do it. In verse 4, we're told that God sent a terrible storm that threatened the ship. In verse 5, the sailors were scared, tossed cargo to lighten the ship, and prayed to their gods. It is worth noting that at the time, Joppa was under Philistine control. These folks were not typically friendly to Jews. Once again, I don't think Jonah traveled with an empty wallet. In verse 6, Jonah is sleeping through all of this, and the captain of the ship wakes him up and begs him to pray to his God. The fact that the shipmaster, or captain, woke him, versus any crew member, once again points to his large purse. He was the captain's stowaway. He paid well to be kept apart and keep his identity hidden. After this, they cast lots, which is an act used throughout the Bible by the faithful, not just the superstitious Philistines. Lots were sticks or stones with markings that could be tossed, similar to dice, to help make difficult decisions. Proverbs 16:33 tells us that the lot is cast into the lap, but its every decision is from the Lord. So this was actually a biblically approved method of making decisions, all the way through the appointment of the disciple to replace Judas. Those lots fell on Matthias in Acts 1:26. Of course, when Abraham decided to cast lots to divide the land, his nephew stopped talking to him. The difficult decision here was determining which of the men had angered the gods. The lots fell on Jonah in verse 7. It is in verse 8 that it becomes apparent that Jonah wasn't open with everyone. They asked where he came from, what he did for a living, his heritage, etc. Nobody knew of his heritage previously. In verse 9, he lets the cat out of the bag, telling them he is a Hebrew and his God is Jehovah. It is in verse 10 we're told he admitted he was running away from God. It's curious to me that in verse 11 they asked him what they should do with him. In verse 12 he told them to toss him overboard and the sea would calm. We do not know how far they made it at this point, but verse 13 gives us the largest clue. They didn't want to toss him overboard, so they tried to row to land. This tells us they were near land. Perhaps they had just left port and attempted to return. Jonah was likely exhausted from his journey, which would explain why he was already asleep. Perhaps he went below deck while the crew loaded the cargo, which may have taken hours. He likely paid enough to avoid having to help. This would be consistent with the documented personality type of Jonah, one of the biggest jerks in the Bible. We'll cover what many consider to be the biggest jerk of all time in episode 4. I don't want to spoil it for you, but it also involves a lot of water. When they failed to reach land, they cried to Jehovah to spare them the blood of Jonah before tossing him overboard in verse 15. And the storm stopped. From here, let's roll over to chapter 2, which is primarily comprised of Jonah's prayer. It also provides some meaty details regarding his fate. In verse 3, he was cast into the sea and water was all around him. No surprise here. When thrown in the ocean, one tends to get wet. In verse 5, he is caught up in seaweed, which is wrapped around his head and likely around his entire body. In this situation, pulled deep into the sea, unable to breathe, swallowing water, and trapped in a bed of seaweed, the Bible tells us here in Jonah 2:5, Jonah did what any practical and reasoning man would do. He died. Jonah 2:5. The waters compassed about me, even to the soul. Even to the soul? He drowned. He gave up the ghost. Took a dirt nap. He assumed room temperature. He kicked the bucket. He started pushing up sea daisies. The only man to survive such a thing was Mr. Geppetto in the fictional work The Adventures of Pinocchio. Ironically enough, the book described Pinocchio and Geppetto being swallowed by a terrible dogfish, though it was depicted as a whale in the Disney movie. Interesting parallel, no? Well, let's get back to Jonah, who did not survive this ordeal. So we are told that Jonah prayed. My guess is that he prayed a lot during the 3 days' journey. Where did his praying start? After all, we've established at this point Jonah is dead. Looking back to Jonah 2 verse 2, we do have clarification. Verse 2 reads, "And he said, I called by reason of mine affliction unto Jehovah, and he answered me. Out of the belly of Sheol cried I, and thou heardest my voice." This is the American Standard Version. Sheol was not the pet name Jonah gave to the beast that swallowed his body. It is worth noting that the King James says, "out of the belly of hell." The word used here is Sheol, which is Strong's reference H7585, described as the underworld, the grave, designation for the abode of the dead, a place of no return. Sheol is the land of the dead. He clarifies this further in verse 6, describing the journey he experienced. "I went down to the bottom of the mountains, the earth with its bars closed upon me forever. Yet hast thou brought up my life from the pit, O Jehovah my God." Deuteronomy 32:22 says, "For a fire is kindled in mine anger, and burneth unto the lowest Sheol, and devoureth the earth with its increase, and setteth on fire the foundations of the mountains." This correlates with Jonah 2:6, where Jonah says he went down to the bottom of the mountains. Ezekiel 31:16 also points to Sheol being located in the nether region of earth. "I made the nations to shake at the sound of his fall when I cast him down to Sheol with them that descend into the pit. And all the trees of Eden, the choice and best of Lebanon, all that drink water, were comforted in the nether parts of the earth." Sheol, according to the Old Testament, housed not only the damned, but the saved as well. Jonah was in direct defiance of God. Note here in Jonah 2:6, he says, "The earth with its bars closed upon me forever." Bars? Like prison bars? This does not sound like Abraham's bosom. At the end of the verse, he removes all doubt, saying, "Thou brought up my life from the pit." This is the Hebrew word shakath, Strong reference H7845, which translates as pit, destruction, grave. Strong's in the KJV also translated as hell, from the Greek Hades. No wonder he was crying out to God in verse 2. He was not being comforted in Abraham's bosom. He was suffering in the midst of the pit. This same word appears many times throughout the Old Testament as the word corruption, which is a synonym for the pit. We'll cover more about that in episode 3. For now, it is important to realize that Jonah was in the place reserved for the damned. The Bible nerd pops up again saying, "While verse 2 does appear to say that he was saying all of this from Sheol, Jonah 2:1 very clearly states that Jonah prayed out of the fish's belly. Is this not a contradiction of your view that Jonah prayed from the pit?" Thank you, Bible nerd, for your valuable insight. Jonah 2:1 does indeed appear to be in contradiction. However, if we go back one verse to Jonah 1:17, we are told that Jonah was in the fish for 3 days and 3 nights. Jonah 2:1 picks up at the end of this 3 days and 3 nights. Jonah most likely regained consciousness inside the belly of the beast just as it was about to vomit. While his first actions were likely pulling away the seaweed and trying to get air, he had to be thanking God simultaneously for bringing him out of the pit. As terrible as his situation in the beast was, it could not have compared with the awful place he had just been. I imagine most of this prayer took place on the beach, where the fish or whale likely washed up before vomiting. It was Jonah's body that was in the fish or whale. This beast was there for transport and preservation of his body, not his life. The seaweed likely served as a temporary barrier against the digestive enzymes. I believe God could have prepared some special submarine hybrid fish for Jonah. I believe he could have provided luxurious accommodations including air conditioning, water cooler, hideaway bed, and a live jazz band to keep him occupied. The point is, he didn't. That's not God's style. It is inconsistent with the manner of God. It is my belief that Jonah was not alone on the beach. I believe Assyrians witnessed his miraculous exit from the beast and provided transportation for the trip to Nineveh. Nineveh is landlocked, and there was a long journey from the beach to the Assyrian capital. I believe this is why they listened to Jonah and heeded his warning, much to his chagrin. There is support for their primary deity being a fish god, which definitely may have contributed to his unwitting and unwilling success. In Jonah 3:5-10, we're told the people of Nineveh believed God and repented. I said earlier that Jonah was a jerk. In chapter 4, we see that Jonah wanted to have a front row seat for the fireworks. He wanted to see Nineveh suffer the same fate as Sodom and Gomorrah, and he was going to enjoy the show. When that didn't happen, he was angry and threw a massive childish fit. The people of Nineveh had been saved, for now, and Jonah was so upset that he was ready to settle back down in the pit. Or perhaps he figured that he had earned a spot in Abraham's bosom, so he might as well go now. Jonah, jerk or not, was a perfect type of Christ, which will be detailed in the final episode of this series. If you do not understand types, I would recommend watching my recent quick guide on types and antitypes. The link is in the description. Some may note that I've avoided directly stating that Jonah went to hell. More about that in the third episode, which will be all about Sheol. Like, comment, and subscribe. Hit that bell to be notified of the next lessons. Please share this far and wide. The description contains all the verses covered here along with study notes. You'll find the link to like my Facebook page. There is an open forum to discuss your thoughts, good, bad, or indifferent. This is the Christian armament, arming you with truth.